Hello, and welcome to Radical Engagements here at Blonde Blog. And today we're going to discuss a brief mini essay blog post by Mark Fisher called Good for Nothing. This was brought to my attention by Quique Autrey, host of the Psyche podcast, who is going to come on this show and talk about this essay with me separately. And we're going to talk about the legacy of Fisher. This will come out just around November. And it was in November of 2013 when I and Paul Shetler and Dario Sinovich and Mateus Krul and Matthew, I can't remember his last name, published Exiting the Vampire Castle at the North Star, the third symposium on call-out culture in response to Occupy, but specifically in response to the People's Assemblies and Russell Brand in the UK. I was living in Mexico at the time. I had participated in Occupy Yoido. I had seen and visited Occupy Oakland and Occupy Zuccotti Park in the winter of 2011. Actually, in the winter of 2012. My friend, the late Paul Shetler, commissioned the piece after running it by me. He was publishing under a pseudonym and editing under a pseudonym with us at the North Star. He was an American living and working, I believe, at the time in the UK. A lot of this stuff gets left out of the recounts of the Vampire Castle piece. The editorial board around it, the responses, even the fact that the article was leaked. And there was a shift in Fisher, and there are two things to notice. I don't claim to be a curator of Fisher's Library. I'll leave that to Zeno Goff, Matt Calhoun, and the Repeater crew with Tariq Goddard and his colleagues over there, now at Repeater Zero. I did not know Fisher very well. I actually never worked with him at Zero. I was brought on after him and Tariq Goddard and the crew around them left under circumstances that were never made entirely clear to me, but had to do with a conflict with the owner. But Fisher and I have been in communication since the middle of 2013. And in some ways, even though this essay has had a life far beyond me, and in fact, my role in it eclipsed me very fast. When Jacobin magazine describes an article you published as Fisher's most loved and most hated essay, and people that you worked with, such as Angela Nagel and Kellogg Normies, and Michael Brooks and Against the Web, talked about this essay, and yet you never were totally comfortable with it. I never was. Not because I disagreed with the critique of call-out culture. It's because I disagreed with the shift towards a kind of old labor reformism that I saw in Fisher. And I saw that narrowing of horizons manifested in the second shift that I see him, which was the increasingly transparent talk about dealing with his depression. which makes reading this today a little hard because we all know how this ends in 2017, don't we? Being upset about it 7 years later, well, not quite 7 years later, 6 years later, and a decade after the article, and my only real tie to Fisher, other than talking about the context of the article that I've done a few times since then, has left me in lurch. I thought about actually doing a line by line response to the Vampire Castle essay now, 10 years later. I wrote one as part of the article panel that came out around the article with Jody Dean, myself, Michael Rettenwald, who's now a right winger, and Sam Chris, who I believe is now canceled, all taking part. I've recounted this a couple of times lately. But Fisher meant something to me, not as a friend. I don't think we knew each other that well. I never met him in person. We corresponded on social media, and we have mutual friends. And eventually I would work for the company that he founded, even though after he'd left it. Him and Tariq Goddard founded Zero. And whatever bad blood they had with Douglas Lane, always seemed to be about something else for me. So for me, this is a way of putting away a ghost, an influence, someone that I knew just enough to care a little about. And so when Quique asked me if I was willing to talk about Fisher's piece, called Good for Nothing, which was really about depression and David Smell, who was a therapist who was concerned with power, I decided that maybe I should also do a reading with you guys. I have not read this before. This being in the occupied times and not on K-Punk, while it may be in the big K-Punk book, which is really huge, I don't remember having read this until Quique pointed it out to me. All right. I'm going to start the piece after a 10-minute prologue. I suppose this one haunts me a bit. Good for Nothing by Mark Fisher, March 19th, 2014. Itself, almost a decade ago. I've suffered from depression intermittently since I was a teenager. When I read that first line, this is Varn talking, God, it hit me different than it would have at the time. It seems innocuous in the context of 2014. It doesn't now. Some of these episodes have been highly debilitating, resulting in self-harm, withdrawal, where it's been months on end in my room, only venturing out to sign in or to buy the minimal amounts of food I was consuming, and time spent on psychiatric wards. I wouldn't say I've recovered from the condition, but I'm pleased to say that both the incidence and the severity of depressive episodes have greatly lessened in recent years. This is Varn talking. That is also haunting now. Partly that is consequence of my changes in my life situation, but it also has to do with the coming to a different understanding of my depression and what caused it. I offer up my own experience of mental distress, not because I think there's anything special or unique about them, but in support of the claim that many forms of depression are best understood and best combated through frames that are impersonal and political rather than individual and psychological. I'm just going to say that for me, it is not that Fisher is wrong that we should view a lot of individual mental states as having a political and social context, but that we shouldn't think of the social and the political as separate from the individual and the psychological in the first place. That acknowledging those antinomies is probably not healthy for anybody, and it's been profoundly unhealthy in our culture, and it's probably not great for the individual either. I'm not here to score a point on Fisher here. I would only venture to do so if he was still around to defend himself. And I think I know what he would say. But nonetheless, I think it's a good thing to think about because I don't want to discard Fisher or Smell's point here that there is something profoundly social and thus political in some limited sense about the frameworks of depression. And it's more than just access to drugs or psychiatric ward care. That said, I would not tell anyone to forego understanding that psychologically simultaneously. Instead of rather, I'd put and. But let us go back. Writing about one's depression is difficult. Writing about one's mental state at all is difficult. That's me talking. Depression is partly constituted by a sneering inner voice that accuses you of self indulgence. If you aren't depressed, you are feeling sorry for yourself, pull yourself together. And this voice is liable to be triggered by going public about the condition. Absolutely. About most mental conditions, let's be honest. Back to Fisher. Of course, this voice isn't an inner voice at all. It is an internalized expression of an actual social force, some of which has vested interest in denying any connection between depression and politics. Absolutely, except the inner voice is a formation of the social voice. The inner self can only speak in the social self's language. It's important to understand that. Both cannot be separated, and we shouldn't have ever tried. It is not that the collective or the individual dominate over one another, it's that they literally inform and construct each other. The very way that you think is not determined by your language, but it is limited by it in the outlier cases. And that language is social. The meanings of word come from a consensus of the group that uses the words. Thus, you can never express yourself, even in your own head, without someone else's voice partly being there, because someone else's voice is how you got your voice at all. Doesn't mean it's not your voice. The line between you and the others who help form you is always and necessarily thin, dialectical, and dialogic simultaneously. You are both differentiating yourself from the other so that you have an identity and taking the other's existence as your way to express your identity, because in the other you can see something like you, something like yourself. After all, in the classical world, it's not that Narcissus fell in love with his reflection, it's Narcissus couldn't tell where he ended. He not just fell in love with himself, but he lost the boundaries of himself and in it drowned. That's the meaning of the story. Back to Fisher. My depression was always tied up with the conviction that I was literally good for nothing. Yeah, I've heard a lot of that from depressives. I'm not the most upbeat person myself. I have been diagnosed with depression and had that diagnosis revamped at different times in my life, and I no longer considered to suffer from depression because probably what was being called depression was being misdiagnosed. If these categories and names of categories are actually that solid, which I'm not sure they are. I think they're like clusters of various habits that we have that can be maladaptive that emerge from perfectly adapted traits. And our ability to name them is to name a cluster of things, often of which are only understood symptomatically anyway. Like depression has multiple pathologies and symptomologies, many of which we probably don't understand even now. Not all of which are just like changes in serotonin levels. But to go back into Fisher here, because I do think I've I've seen people who have that voice, and I've seen what it does to them, and it's real hard. It's real hard to watch too. I spent most of my life up to 30 believing that I would never work. In my 20s, I drifted from postgraduate study, periods of unemployment, and temporary jobs. Man, I feel you. I did that too. Till I was 27 years old and got my first teaching gig. Was an adjunct. I was a pizza worker. I worked at a corrections facility. Let's just call it what it is, a prison. I was a cash loading dock worker. I worked as an insurance accounts receivable auditor. Yeah, did a lot of jobs. Tutored on the side. Was a pizza manager. Did all these things in my 20s. It felt like nothing was ever going to be permanent. Nothing like a career. I remember that. In postgraduate study, because I was a dilettante who'd somehow faked his way through, not a proper scholar. You know, one thing I used to think that I was not a proper scholar, that I met proper scholars, Mark, and you know, I know you're not going to hear this. And man, was it a shock how few of them actually impressed me. And I worshiped those guys before I met them. You know, I thought the people from Yale and Harvard were gods among men because I believed in that meritocratic nonsense. Anyway, back to Mark's point. In unemployment, because I wasn't really unemployed like those who were honestly seeking work, but a shirker. And in temporary jobs, because I felt I was performing incompetently. In any case, I didn't really belong in the office or factory jobs, not because I was too good for them, but very much the contrary, because I was overeducated and useless. Yeah, I remember feeling that way. When I got my master's degree and I hadn't got a job in schools I could see the recession coming in 2006 and I was literally getting turned down for like temporary work at Toys R Us, which was about to go out of business anyhow. Yeah, I've definitely been there, Mark. God, I'm talking to you like you're still alive. All right. But taking the job of someone who needed it and deserved it more than I did. I never felt that. Even when I was on a psychiatric ward, I felt like I was not really depressed. I was only simulating the condition in order to avoid work, or in the infernally paradoxical logic of depression, I was simulating it in order to conceal the fact that I was not capable of working and that there was no place at all for me in society. God, that sounds awful. I'm not gonna lie. I don't normally get emotional reading something, uh, and this one's getting to me a little bit. Like I said, I want to claim that Mark and I were close. We never met in person. We'd only exchanged uh, information back and forth through social media and in emails. And you know, I edited his article, um, and responded to it. But yeah, this one's getting to me a little bit. When I eventually got a job as a lecturer at further education college, I was for a while elated. Yet by its very nature, this elation showed that I had not shaken off the feelings of worthlessness that would soon lead into further periods of depression. I lacked the calm confidence of one born to the role. As some, not very submerged level, I eventually still did not believe that I was the kind of person who could do the job like teaching. But where did this belief come from? As a side note, I don't think anyone's good at teaching their first 3 years of doing it. I'm a damn good teacher, but my first years in a college lecture hall, which is where I actually started, not a high school. Then in a high school and in summer camps teaching creative writing. God, I felt terrible at it for the first couple years. When I first started teaching university, I was a graduate assistant who technically was under a professor who I never dealt with and would sign off on almost anything I did as long as my grade ratio came back correctly. Um, Teaching people who were 5 years my junior, it was an interesting experience. Anyway, the dominant school of thought in psychiatry locates the origins of such beliefs in a malfunctioning brain chemistry, which are to be corrected by pharmaceuticals. It's interesting how 10 years changes things, right? This is no longer even the dominant paradigm in the US, despite the insurance companies' use of pharmaceuticals because they're cheaper. Therapy has exploded as in at least conjunction with, there's not a replacement for a lot of the therapeutic models, particularly because right after Fisher wrote this piece, the severity of the replication crisis, even in psychiatry, not just in psychology, really became known. Anyway, psychoanalysis and forms of therapy influenced by it famously looked at the roots for mental distress and family background, while cognitive behavioral therapy, which was dominant till a few years ago, is less interested in locating the source of negative beliefs than it is in simply replacing them with a set of positive stories. I don't think that's actually true of classical cognitive behavioral therapy. It is true of the positive psychology that came out of cognitive behavioral therapy, but early cognitive behavioral therapy was actually very much uh, a little bit of Freud and a whole lot of Marcus Aurelius. Um, it was actually originally CBT was a pretty harsh form of therapy, but as it became popular in the aughts, it morphed into its positive version, and then it became about attitude adjustment. And in a way, CBT kind of replaced classical behaviorism, even though it's even in the name, cognitive behavioral therapy. It combines two conceivingly opposed paradigms, right? Cognitivism and behavioralism have generally been opposed in psychological theories. Anyway, this is just me expanding on something that's a minor thing in Fisher here, but I do think it needs to be expanded on because it's a generalization that isn't entirely true. It was, however, really true in 2014, particularly in the forms of CBT that were probably big enough to go to Europe at the time. I mean, it had been in Europe before. That's not my point. But this was around the time 2008 to like 2014 is when positive psychology really began to be put on the radar, because it was even being used by the military to help soldiers be less depressed and suicidal when they came back, particularly as they moved from classical soldiering where there's a risk to drone striking, which we still don't understand the psychological effects of. But if the suicidal ideation rates of the military are any indication, it's even worse on people. It's really not natural to kill people at little risk to yourself. Anyway, it is not that these models are entirely false. Thank you, Fisher. Uh, it is that they miss and must miss the most likely cause of the feelings of inferiority, social power. This is a fair and true point, I think. The form of social power that has the most effect on me was class power. Although, of course, gender, race, and other forms of oppression work by producing the same sense of ontological inferiority. This is interesting because people would think Fisher didn't care about that stuff because of the Vampire Castle essay. I mean, he not only cares about them, but he puts them on equal ontological classifications. I mean, it's almost intersectional, right? So there's a shift in Fisher by 2014. I don't know if he's changing his opinion. There's a lot of things about Fisher, the more I read his essays, that were changing constantly. And I think a lot of people don't pick up that they were changing constantly because we want our heroes. And for a lot of people, Fisher was a hero and is a hero. To be more consistent. But I think it's better to see the growth of a thinker like this, even if some of the growth isn't where I would have wanted him to go. All right. Which is best expressed in exactly the thought I articulated above, that one is not the kind of person who can fulfill the roles which are earmarked for the dominant group. I think that does probably express the way a lot of these psychological pathologies play out. And I think that's also kind of supported by, like, if you the research that indicates that, like, in like pre-modern societies, uh people who are so embedded in community groups that the uh cost of mental pathologies is not nearly as great on them, and so there's less suicidal ideation and whatnot in a lot of cases. That's not to say I don't want anyone to have this Lapsarian logic that if we just went back to like the 17th century that people would not have mental health conditions. But nonetheless, on the urging of one of the readers of my book, Capitalist Realism, I started to investigate the work of David Smell. Smell, a therapist, but one who makes the question of power central to his practice, confirmed the hypothesis about depression that I stumbled towards. In his crucial book, The Origins of Unhappiness, Smell describes how the marks of class are designed to be indelible. For those whom from birth are taught to think of themselves as lesser, the acquisition or qualification of wealth will seldom be sufficient to erase. Okay, this is crucial to a difference between Fisher and I, and this came up in an interview for Diet Soap when Fisher was interviewed by Diet Soap on the Vampire Castle piece, where I said Fisher's conception of class was more cultural, more British, or more influenced by people like Pierre Bardou, more interested in things like your habitus, your background, than your actual current class position. Now, a lot of people took me to be saying that class background doesn't matter. And that's not true. It absolutely does, but it's a separate question from the way we talk about this in Marxism. But your class background probably has a ton of effect on your personality. Like, it's not just that when you meet a person that you can figure a lot by their social class. You can figure a lot about where their social class they were born in and what specific sections of it even. And how they've traveled from that, where they've gone. Most people, even if they stay in a broad scale social class, like they're still a worker or they're still middle class or whatever, depending on what kind of class schema you're using, there's movement laterally and maybe even slightly up and down within a very small ratio. It's not that class is static. It's not. Although the more you zoom out, the more still it looks. But anyway, however, now that I'm thinking about this may be why he was so insistent on us taking the cultural origins of someone's class origin so consistently. One of the fights that Fisher and I had indirectly was whether or not anyone would consider Russell Brand working class. Not that he wasn't working class or had working class background affiliations, but that he was currently working class when he was famous after forgetting Sarah Marshall. Make of that what you will. I don't want to get too lost in Russell Brand, given the scandals around him. But this focus on our habitus, where we come from, and what informs us, does inform a lot of our cultural norms and thus the inner voices and the way we can speak to and about ourselves. And I think Fisher's absolutely right about that. I just think it's a separate question from what Marx was talking about. And for Fisher, as I understood him in 2013 and 14, right? I don't want to speak for him in his whole life. Like I said, I did not know the man like that. We just exchanged some letters and occasionally had Facebook chats. And I edited his article. One. But I would venture to say uh, that that's why he thought it was so important to insist on class origins being important, not just because of the British kind of semi-caste notion of class, but also because of the way habitus affects the way you understand, communicate in the world, how it limits your quote meritocratic possibilities, how much more work it takes to do the same things. And it's not because the people who are doing them lack merit all the time. A lot of times it's just nepotism, but not always. They've had advantages that got them there in the first place that came with having wealth, the leisure time to study, people who know what to tell you to do and how to model the minds, etc. This is important. It's undoubtedly important, but it can kind of be bought. All right. So just pointing this out, because reading this right now, that emphasis in Fisher that I didn't understand when I was kind of debating him in 2013 and 2014 makes a lot more sense to me why he insisted on it. I'm a lot more sympathetic to it now, even though I see that from a Marxist perspective, it's still kind of not the point. Now, should we limit ourselves to only a Marxist perspective? No. But we should understand it. Someone who moves out of the social sphere they are supposed to occupy is always in danger of being overcome by feelings of vertigo, panic, and horror. Quote, isolated, cut off, surrounded by hostile space, you are suddenly without connections, without stability, with nothing to hold you upright or in place, a dizzying, sickening unreality that takes possession of you. You are threatened by a complete loss of identity, a sense of utter fraudulence. You have no right to be here. Now, inhabiting this body, dressed in this way, you are nothing. And that nothing is literally what you feel you are about to become. Yeah, Smale does hit on something there, and I've felt it. Not in like the JD Vance screwing up with your fork at the high end dinner way after some Ohio senator has got you a good placement in the military and that was able to get you some deals to get you into a good Ivy League university, which by the way, he probably really did work for. It's just he got the break to do it, even though he was from the working class, right? It's not just in that way. I got breaks too. First time I was a university lecturer abroad, having been a high school teacher and studying in Korea. And actually, I came back home and it was during Occupy itself. I was at a bar with some people at the Platypus Affiliated Society the day before I joined the organization after doing study groups with one of their members in Korea. And I was sitting across from an anarchist who mocked the fact that I didn't know Mandarin. Now, I'm not going to out this anarchist's name. I don't even probably remember it because I'm drunk. But I will say he went to a prominent and very expensive elite liberal arts college in New York. You can figure out which one. And I was faced with the fact that I was, while a poet and while highly educated, because I did not have the background or the leisure time, and I had floated trying to work jobs and solidify my position in a nascent white collar world when my parents were mostly from a blue collar world. And I say mostly because I've told this story 1,000 times now. My mom became a nurse when I was an adult. I remember that feeling like I was going to shrink into nothing. And instead of getting depressed, I became angry. First, at actually the class that I came from. Why had they not prepared me? And then at the people around me, at least in abstract. Now, I didn't always resent the people personally. but I hated their advantages, their neighborhoods. When they would shame me when I would talk about a $350,000 house in 1990s money being rich, and someone saying, "You don't know what rich is." And you know what? They were right. I didn't. But from my perspective, as a person who had a mechanic stepdad and three brothers and three half brothers and a stepsister, lived in a small house where we were doubled up in rooms. Yeah, of course that seemed like Ralph to me. And if I'd have grown up in another place where people probably lived in small apartments, would have been the same. Although even the comparisons between property values at that time would not have been is not really comparable. There's a certain way in which you have to deal with the reality of being in the developed world, but there's also a way in which sometimes people even in the developed world are not comparing things accurately because of the differences in geographic resources. Nonetheless, that feeling of wanting to of utter fraudulent, not because you didn't work for it, because you did, not because you don't have the capacity, because you do, but because you're not the right kind of person. Oh yeah, I know that feeling. I know it very well, and I know what Fisher's talking about here. This is why when I have some disagreements with this piece, it's rarely to say no, Fisher's wrong. It is instead to say there should have been an and here and not a nor. For some time now, the most successful tactics of the ruling class has been responsibilization. Each member of the subordinate class is encouraged into feeling their poverty, lack of opportunities, or unemployment. It is their fault and their fault alone. Even if it's not their fault, that the other thing that people in the upper classes do is make you a victim of which they can help you out. But but the victimization politics of that is, oh, we can help the victim, the noble victim. They have a disadvantage and we can correct with that, and then they can be meritocratically uplifted without realizing that their ability to even determine that gives them a special place in the hierarchy. But that even if it's, I think Fisher's like oversimplifying actually how this can go up. Like people people can be told they're victimized by social structures and still be under the noblesse oblige of these people who are their class higher ups. And I don't think Fisher accounts for that enough in this article. Anyway, individuals will blame themselves rather than social structures. Absolutely true. That whole Americans are temporarily embarrassed millionaires, unless there's active class institutions, that happens all over the world. Right? It's not a pathology unique to the United States. It's just that some places have institutions that check against it by reminding you of things. Thank you, Europeans. I don't love you very much, but on this you're better. Kind of. Or at least you used to be. All right. Which in any case, they have been induced to believing do not really exist. They are just excuses called upon by the weak. What Smell calls magical voluntarism. The belief it is within the individual's power to make themselves whatever they want to be is the dominant ideology and unofficial religion of contemporary capitalist society, pushed by reality TV experts and business gurus as much as by politicians. Even when it's not, though, this is still pernicious. I think Fisher focusing on this particular 90s, 80s, 90s, aughts neoliberal form of it kind of removes the perniciousness of other forms of it, as the poor as noble victim, as the poor as, not as subjugated, just as unlucky. Both of those deny reality, a reality of power. One makes you responsible, the other makes you agentless. But both obscure and occultate power. Anyway. pushed by reality TV experts and business schools as much by politicians. Magical voluntarism is both the effect and cause of the currently historical low levels of class consciousness. I mean, X abstraction is the effect and cause of X abstraction is impossible to prove. I suspect this is kind of true, but I don't think it's the only reason for the historically low levels of class consciousness. Rent seeking amongst leadership, magical volunteerism, um, the redistribution of the labor force, the way the labor force became more alienated and desocialized in its work, not in socialist sense, but literally in like you don't work in factories anymore, and you're not even often working in small groups. And a lot of the outsource that used to have to depend on other people for has now been automated either by robots or computers. All that plays into this. But I do think magical voluntarism is the dominant ideological narrative for why there is low class consciousness. I don't know that it's actually the cause per se, but it's the excuse that we psychologically run into. It is a flip side of depression. I don't know that depression has a simple flip side. All right, back to Fisher, whose underlying conviction is that we are uniquely responsible for our own misery and therefore deserve it. I mean, yeah, depression does seem to have that manifestation in our culture anyway, which does kind of lend a point to Fisher's point here. A particularly vicious double bind is imposed on the long-term unemployed now in the UK, a population that has been licensed the message that it is good for nothing and simultaneously told that it can do anything it wants to do. Yeah, that's a nasty double bind, and it's real in the UK and it was real in the US too. It's real probably in continental Europe to a lesser degree. All right, back to Fisher. We must understand the fatalistic submission of the UK's population to austerity as a consequence of a deliberately cultivated depression. In so much that you're viewing depression as the result of a power relationship, yes, but I don't know that you can generalize that to depression. Anyway, this depression is manifested in the acceptance of things that will get worse. For all but a small elite, that we are lucky to have a job at all, so we shouldn't expect wages to keep pace with inflation. Yeah, this is all going to get much worse, Mark, after you die. I'm sorry, mate. I'm really sorry. That we cannot afford the collective provisions of the welfare state. Well, you kind of can't now. You could then. I mean, yeah. Oh, God. This is so sad. I'm actually getting really sad. All my mock hatred for the English has gone away, and I just feel angry and sad at the same time. So many people around this that I have known, that I've worked with, are gone. And so many people I grew up with in Macon, Georgia, are gone. Depression, alcoholism, a slow ratcheting down of expectations, even in their expectations of survival. In the last 3 years, 4 friends have died, one of whom is famous. My father died youngish, 68. My mom's been battling illness for 5 years at 68. I've known so many people to die in their 40s. And it's creeping up the class ladder even. The liberal one, I mean. The stratas of income. And it's worse in the UK. It's way worse in the UK. Outside of London, a lot of the UK has the purchasing power of the average Mississippian. And that was before things really got bad there. yes, the nostalgia for Empire was awful, but there's also a real sense in which, like, the UK's whole way of being was based on that empire. And now class consciousness is in some ways coming, but there's no political representation for it. And Starmer's Labour Party and the workers are fighting back, but they aren't winning. In some ways, I'm glad Fisher isn't here to see it, but I'd rather he be here. I gotta finish this essay. All right. Collective depression as a result of the ruling class project of resubordination. For some time now, we have been increasingly accepted the idea that we are not the kind of people who can act. There is this binary in Fisher and in Graeber, who I like a lot less than Fisher, although I don't hate Graeber either, and I wish he was still here too. It was so strange to lose so many of the new left figures and the Gen X left figures at around the same time. Anyway, okay, this will be me being upset. It's terrible audio and video. Before I talk to Quique, I am going to need to have processed this, so let's continue. For some time now, we have increasingly accepted the idea that we are not the kind of people who can act. This is what I was going to say. There's a voluntarism here, but it's not a voluntarism that goes to the next step and goes, what are the conditions in which we can thrive? There's like a lack of hope that flips into total hope, right? A determinism that flips into total voluntarism and vice versa. Like, what are the steps? And I've felt this way for David Graeber since actually the Debt book, which is in some ways a brilliant book, and in some ways tries to read historical categories in all kinds of places it shouldn't, and then is really weirdly insistent about very strict historical categories in places where nobody else is. There's a voluntarism there that if we just believed another way was possible, we could, by believing it and organizing ourselves, it would be possible. But I think we actually have to look at the conditions that made it possible organically. What do we have to replicate in the real world? Yes, we can do that. We can learn like that, right? But we can't just will it and that be enough. And I'm not saying that that's what they said either, but that was the way they focused. That was true for Graeber, and in some degrees that was true for Fisher too. And I think as that developed, it led to a narrowing of political horizons in both their cases. Graeber never dropped his anarchism, but he became a lot more copacetic to liberal reformism after his frankly quite absurd statements during Occupy. And Fisher, who in general had a critique of social democracy as the kind of milquetoast answer to the problem, eventually says that reforms are worth doing, which even I think they're worth doing, and that political horizon shouldn't be set as not good enough. It is a shrinking of the horizons so that you can voluntarily react. One cannot blame someone suffering from both the social voices in their head and depression for feeling like they can do everything and then everything is hopeless. I just think in some ways, even this argumentation that like, oh, this is a social voice put on you that's causing this depression, it's enforced upon you, but we could believe something else. Well, premise A and premise B are they're not totally contradictory, but they're not entirely copacetic either. The rebuilding of class consciousness is a formidable task indeed, and one cannot achieve it by calling upon ready-made solutions. I agree with that. But in spite of our collective depression, what our collective depression tells us, it can be done. Inventing new forms of political involvement, reviving the institutions that become decadent, converting privatized defection into politicized anger. All of this can happen, and when it does, who knows what is possible. God, this hurts now. For a long time, I've been imagined as the voice of no. On the left, I'm a lot of people listen to me, but they resent me because I'm the voice of no, or I say things and try to contextualize things as best I can. But a lot of times, it's like you're deluded, you're constructing a myth, uh, you're you are being optimistic in a way that's actually narrowing your horizons. You're not looking at the full spectrum. I believe in actual solidarity and efficacy, but I don't believe that it can come out of just willing something delusionally. That you have to be brutally honest about where you are and where it may come from. The fact that the right, however incoherently, in its weird, bizarro, and frankly false Alice Jones-like narratives, was still better able to articulate this in some ways than the left was, because the left was wedded to one of the branches in control of the situation. It is not like Blurite Labor and Obamaite Democrats were not in control. For all of our Obama was defeated by the by the Republicans in Congress rhetoric, we must remember that the Democrats had in 2008 the largest majority anybody had in all three branches of government since the 1960s. Even Reagan did not achieve such hegemony, and yet they lost it in months. Now, it was a predictable loss. It followed patterns going all the way back to the 60s. But it was a much more stunning loss. But it's not like they didn't have power. And then when they lost power, they pretended they never had it at all. And we wedded up to that. And in my mind, yes, people are responsible for their own lives. Yes, nothing is about what anyone deserves, okay? You all deserve the world, and you're not going to get it, even under socialism. I want you to understand that, all right? Because it's not about what you deserve. Or if you don't deserve the world, you all deserve nothing, all right? The first thing in your head should always be the justice that is about what people deserves is based on us having a common understanding what deserve is, and we don't. And thus, since we don't have that common understanding, it is merely projection. It's a childhood fantasy. Nothing is about what anyone deserves. Now, what can we do to make lives better and to give power back to people in a real way and for us to survive? When I was thinking about this article, I was not thinking that it was going to make me this upset. And every time I think about Fisher, I get a little bit more upset. Of the people that I've lost in this milieu, I was thinking about this the other day. Mateus and I don't talk. I haven't spoken to Dario in years. I don't even remember one of the editor's last names. And Paul is dead too. Died in his late 50s, right before COVID. Just dropped. People are so full of fucking whatever, that I know so many people having brain aneurysms in their 40s and 50s and just dropping like flies. Fisher was brave to see these social connections. But I think the narrative he wanted to tell himself was a little too simple. And it's impossible to judge someone by that in throes of depression. It's impossible. I'm going to make this public for the free feed, though it's hard. I don't like people seeing me emotional. Anger is an emotion I can express. This is grief. Grief at politics, grief at lives wasted, grief at an inability of vision. And grief is not depression. And it's not quite rage either. Read this article. I'm going to talk about it again with Quique Autrey on a mutual podcast, and I will have worked out my emotions, be able to talk about it a lot more clearly. Then it'll be available on this channel and on both of our podcast feeds, I believe, in November. Have a great don't let the man get you down.